Hello and welcome to the Reactive Dog Pod. I am your host, Tess Morgan. I am a multi-certified dog behavior consultant who specializes in the treatment of reactivity in dogs. Through my business, Treat Yourself Dog Training and Behavior, I help clients make progress and enjoy life again with their reactive dogs. Join me and my guests as we dive into all things reactivity. We'll explore behavior concepts, talk about real-life training plans and considerations for reactive dogs, provide tips and tricks, and discuss how we can best help reactive dogs and their families thrive. Because reactive dogs are good dogs, they just need a little bit of extra support. Let's get into it. Although reactivity can and does show up across all breeds and mixes, herding breed dogs often seem overrepresented when it comes to this issue. Why is this the case, and what factors could be contributing to herding dogs developing reactivity? What are some of their most common triggers, and what can we do to support them in making progress and living their life to the fullest? My guest today specializes in this very topic, and I'm looking forward to sitting down with her to talk all things herding dogs. Emily Priestley began her career with dogs working in pit bull rescue, pulling dogs who were out of options from shelters. From there, she started her decade-long shelter career with the BC SPCA, working with some of the province's most challenging cases. Her transition from the shelter to full-time training was born out of a passion for helping dogs who are out of options and owners who have seemingly tried everything. She now specializes in herding breeds, assisting owners with reactivity, fear and aggression, compulsive disorders, and dogs whose traditional work traits clash with their owner's lifestyle. Emily's goal is to help owners understand their dogs and help the dogs live their best lives. She is a CTC through the Academy for Dog Trainers and a CDBC through the IAABC, and she owns and operates Wild at Heart Dog Training. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Before we start talking about this topic, I wanted to ask about your current crew of dogs, because I know you have all herding dogs, and I also heard a rumor that there's another dog coming down the funnel. Do you want to tell me a little bit about your dog and whether any of them have struggled with reactivity?
Yeah. So I have, we currently have 3 dogs. We've got Mozzie, who is well known on social media. She's sort of like everybody's favorite. She's our little rescue Australian cattle dog. And she definitely, like, I will talk, I'm sure, about like reactivity and what it means and things like that. She's definitely one that we could have labeled as reactive. She's a recovering fearful dog, and I like to say recovering or like in remission, because we can never really kind of cure that, but that's another whole topic. But she's overcome like a lot of what we could label as reactivity. Stormy is my rescue working line border collie, and she's about as easy as they come. So she doesn't really have anything that we would label as reactive. And then we've got Griffin, who's our working line border collie. And he also is not one that we would say is reactive, although he doesn't like small children. So we could probably say he's reactive towards kids. And then there is another dog coming hopefully end of September, who is a trialing border collie, fully trained, so that I'm able to really get my feet wet in the trialing world and see how it goes. Because right now Griffin is learning how to herd, but I'm green, he's green. It's a lot to learn. And so having a dog who's fully trained, I'll be able to learn a lot from them.
Yeah.
So yeah, there'll be more coming about him eventually, but right now until I pay the deposit, I'm like really trying to keep it under wraps, just so I don't get my hopes up too much, but it's exciting.
Yeah, that is really exciting. I feel like I would not be able to keep up with that dog.
Well, I met him this year. Like, we just went to meet him. He was trialing at in the interior, and he's about as easy as they come. He'll be a senior when I take him on. But when I met him, I was talking to his current owner, and I said, "Is it okay if I go and take him for a walk?" I had never actually met the dog. I said, "Is it okay if I go and take him for a walk?" And he's like, yeah, he's tied up at the trailer. Just there's a leash there. You can go grab him. And like, keep in mind, this is not a dog I've ever met. And it was like right away, it was like I instantly fell in love, because to have this dog where you feel confident enough about their behavior that a stranger can just go grab them and take them for a walk. We don't see that very often
Oh,
in the training world. Most dogs wouldn't accept a stranger like that. And so I knew right away that it was a dog that I wanted. And he is as easy as that. So it's pretty exciting.
that's really exciting. I'm excited to hopefully see pictures and hear more about them. So today we're going to be talking about reactivity and herding dogs. And I think that I have to watch myself because I find myself becoming negative about herding dogs without really even noticing, because there are challenges that show up a lot with these types of dogs, especially for people who don't have experience with them. So before we talk about the challenges and the reactivity component, I want to talk about why so many people love herding dogs, because if you look at like an average group of trainers, there's herding dogs. Almost every
Yeah.
trainer has a herding dog, right? And so there are reasons that they make really amazing companions and really great dogs for people who enjoy training and sports and that kind of thing. So do you want to talk a little bit about why you chose to specialize in herding dogs and what the really great qualities about them are?
Yeah, I love that we're talking about this because I feel the same. Like when I do webinars and stuff like that, I feel like it's me just talking about like doom and gloom for an hour because it's all of these like, all of what can go wrong. But there's a lot that is great. So what I think I like, they're very different breeds. Like we had Zelda, who was our Belgian Shepherd, and obviously we have the Border Collies and the cattle dog, and very, very different. And like living with all of them was very different. But what I love about them is that they are, active companions. I like to be out in the rain, walking, hiking, playing, muddy, swimming. I like to do all of that with my dogs, and I like willing participants. We used to have pit bulls, and I actually, they're still one of my true loves, but they're not as rugged as maybe people might think. So, in the winter, in the cold, when their paws were wet and they were cold and tired and things like that, like the herding breed dogs are designed for that kind of stuff. So I personally, and I think we're going to talk a bit about it today. For some people, that is a downside. For me, that's a plus. And then, we often get into them, I think, as trainers because a lot of them, like especially if we look at the Border Collies, they're bred to work with a handler. So their job is very rarely by themselves. So they like to follow directions and do what we ask. And so that really translates well into like trick training and like agility and demo dogs for things, because they make us look great because I find them very easy to train. But I just really love that they are so willing to just be active and to jump into things. And that's what I love about like what I love doing with my dogs these days. But that I started specializing in them because I was wanting to work with dogs who were fearful. That was my original um, passion, is helping dogs who are scared. And as someone who has herding breed dogs, people started coming to me because they wanted someone who understood them. And so it just kind of, spiraled from there. And it really is, it's a matter of like, and they're very popular. And we think we know a lot about them, but they really are often the underdogs. And so that's where I just fell in love with them. And the specialization kind of grew from there.
It's a really great specialization because, like you said, so many people have them, and a lot of those people maybe signed up for something that they weren't aware of what it encompassed.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and the other thing is like we shouldn't get dogs based on their looks, but herding breed dogs they're gorgeous, right? I
They
understand
are.
onto them.
Yeah, and that's another whole podcast. Unfortunately, like, when you and I both come from the BCSPCA, and for a decade, we didn't see cattle dogs in the shelter. We didn't see Malinois in the shelter. Zelda's litter was the first litter of Belgian Shepherds that I saw during my career. And when I saw them, I was like, I got to get one because we never see these, and I wanted one so bad. And now if you go through their adoptable animals, like regularly, you'll see Malinois available for adoption. And cattle dogs are the same. Like when we got and we got Mozzie would have only been like, let's say 4 years ago, when we brought her home. She was only like maybe the like second or third cattle dog that we had in shelter ever.
Mm.
And now they're like nonstop, they're showing up in shelters. And they do. It's like, and the unfortunate part about them is that they look cool. So people are really drawn to that look. And then when we look at like the border collies, we see a lot of dogs who are bred for color. So they're merle, these like stormy blue merle or red merle dogs, that kind of thing. And that's another, it's like a fad more than anything. But it's sort of like an inflation bubble, I think, where it's like we're putting out more and more and more of these dogs, but we're not really prepared for them just yet. So it's become, within like a few short years, it's just gone, from one end of the spectrum to the other. So
Mhm.
the dogs are really the ones paying the price for that.
Another one I see a lot, like German Shepherds are consistently among the most popular breeds, and they are not by any means an easy breed, especially for someone who's like never had a dog before.
Yeah, or even like outside of the herding group, I'm like always shocked at the number of livestock guardian dogs that are showing up
Mhm.
in shelters, because, and like weird mixes, like livestock guardian breeds with like cattle dog. Um, like yikes. I mean, it's there, people aren't always prepared for those dogs.
I feel like we could talk forever about this,
Yeah.
but I want to talk about why herding dogs are so often seen by trainers for reactivity. I know personally, like from my own anecdotal experience, a lot of the dogs I see for reactivity are some kind of herding breed or herding breed mix, and it's kind of well known among trainers that these dogs can be more prone to what we would label as reactivity. Why do you think this is? Like, why do we see so many herding dogs with this issue?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the big thing for me is like these dogs are bred for certain traits that make them, they're unparalleled in their job ethic and what they can do. But if we look at it as a series of behaviors, so if we look at what a herding breed dog does to herd livestock, um, there's lunging, barking, biting, chasing, bouncing, all of these behaviors. And it works because, livestock, when we're talking about cattle or sheep, goats, they don't need to be taught to move away from a dog like that, because they are a prey animal. So they're going to move away from anything that's acting predatory or acting weird, even border collie stalking and things like that. The sheep get that. But then if we look over at reactivity, or what people describe as reactivity, lunging, growling, barking, bouncing, all chasing, biting, all of the same things show up. And these dogs, like we would say, they come by it honestly. Like we bred them to move through the world that way. And we bred them to have triggers, which is usually movement. They love to control movement, and movement usually kind of, flips that switch on for them. And so it's like if you didn't see what the dog was doing or reacting to, you might have a hard time deciding what by just watching a dog if they are, reacting to a trigger in a problem context or hurting, right? So it's like all of their traits, all of the things that we bred them to do, just a slight, if we just turn the wheel a little bit, now we're in a completely different context. It's a huge problem, and now it's a problem that has to be fixed. So um and then especially when we get this, like the combination of that being triggered by movement, we get cars and bikes. I think we're going to talk about triggers in a bit, but um it's, if you have a kid whipping by on a bike and a dog rushes after that and bites the tire, for the dog in a lot of situations, that's not any different than if it was a sheep. um so I think, they're just their template that we created, that we made for them, is in could be, if you wanted to, you could call it reactivity.
And then also we have them with these kind of bred with these behaviors, and then we have them on leashes all the time where they can't actually ever act out these behaviors. So of course there's going to be some frustration baked into there as well.
Oh, and that's the thing, right? So the first time I took Griffin to see sheep, and I was meeting someone who is a very seasoned sheepdog handler, and she said, okay, like leash him up and take him in, right? And he sees sheep for the first time, and he was lunging and barking and growling, and his hackles were up, and he was like all worked up. And she had me do a few things, and we came back out, and I was like, oh my gosh, like in my head, I'd never, this is my first experience like training a sheepdog. And I was like, oh my God, it's, this is going to be such a big problem. He's like, so, his reactions, you could say he's so reactive. And she was like,
Mhm.
well, that's normal for a young dog. He just doesn't have training, he doesn't have experience, he needs to figure it out. She was like completely unfazed. But so we have to train the sheepdog. But in a pet home, we're not training the dog until it's too late
Mhm.
to handle themselves around what sometimes is a stand-in for livestock. And
Mhm.
I do want to be clear to the people listening too, that um, when you see your dog reacting, it's not always just hurting, quote unquote hurting. I think that's one of
Mhm.
the biggest mistakes we make, is thinking that herding breed dogs, when they react, when they look hurty, that they're just hurting. I think about hurting as very benign, whereas like some of these dogs will also be fearful, and their response towards their trigger looks like hurting, but it
Mhm.
isn't. So I'm certainly not trying to say that all hurting or all reactivity is just hurting. But when we see these dogs on livestock, we know as handlers that they require training, and we don't get overwhelmed when we see them being like that in the beginning. They're going to go in
Mhm.
and we're going to train them. Our pet dogs, same software, same behaviors, different trigger, but we often don't give them the tools in order to deal with that. So they're lacking that guidance in most
Mhm.
cases.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. As you were talking, I was thinking, I was just making a note about how we label behavior that's actually just totally normal dog or breed behavior as reactivity, and that the behavior itself isn't necessarily a problem, but it's just like it's a problem for the owner having to navigate that behavior. And then it's also potentially a problem for the dog if there's a fear or frustration component that's not being addressed, but also for like quality of life reasons, if that dog is just chronically frustrated and chronically trying to kind of like execute that behavior and never can, right? So I think it's like this weird thing where like the behavior itself is actually pretty normal, but it's just the problems occur kind of in the situations that we put those dogs in rather than the
Yeah.
behavior itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I like to think about it like it's usually problematic for, like, obviously it's problematic for the dog if the dog is fearful, right?
Mhm.
And they're
Mhm.
reacting. But usually a lot of these dogs, it's problematic for us, but we miss the fact that sometimes that it serves a function for the dog. So
Mhm.
if a dog is hurting, maybe they want to chase that car just because it does trigger their software. Um, or if the dog is frustrated, that's how they cope with frustration. Or if the dog is upset with their trigger and they are scared of it, that's how they deal and process something that is scary to them. So we often just see it as like problems, and you're right, it's actually for the dog, they do react to things, and
Mhm.
they do move through the world differently than us. So um, the usually when I hear someone say that their dog is reactive, it tells me a lot more about like what the handler is experiencing, that it's something
Mhm.
that they see as a problem. But the dog might actually just be like, if we got into their head, they might just be like, I'm fine. This is like
Just
a,
doing my thing.
yeah, works perfectly for me.
Yeah. The other thing that comes to mind is cattle dogs and biting. Like that's one that you see come up a lot.
Mhm.
And that's a tricky one, right? Because like they could be biting out of fear, or they could
Yes.
be biting because they're a cattle dog and they think kind of mouth first. And so I'm feel like that's almost impossible for someone who doesn't know much about cattle dogs to kind of tease apart at the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I just posted on social media last night about that very topic, and the comments are what we just talked about. The comments, there's a lot of comments where people are like, they're not aggressive, they just do that because they're hurting. Well, you can't say that, right? There's a lot of dogs who are going to bite out of fear. Or they might bite out of excitement, or they might bite, like, a mouth on, whatever we want to call it, nip, bite, whatever it is. They'll do it for a lot of reasons, but it's not always just hurting. Certainly they just will put their mouth on you very quickly.
I've experienced that firsthand. Um, we've talked about kind of the general problems about reactive dogs being, or not reactive dogs, herding dogs being put into these kind of unnatural human situations. And that is even like more intensified when you think about urban environments. So like, herding border collie in downtown Toronto or whatever that busy city is. I think a lot of the problems are the same as they would be in other areas, but there's definitely a lot of things that are harder if you're in an apartment, if you're in like a super busy urban area.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk a little bit about your clients that are in that situation and what their kind of unique issues are when they have these types of dogs?
Yeah, well, the first thing is, I'm always trying to get dogs distance from what they're reacting to. The farther back you are from something that is scary to you or frustrating for you, the easier it is for you to cope with. I love using, I think we're going to talk about it today, but like desensitization and counter conditioning for these dogs. We start to lose that when we're in urban, like, I have tons of clients who live along like the seawall in Vancouver, like heavily populated well trafficked area. There's cars, there's people, and there's not the here, if I go out for a walk and I see a dog coming down the way down the road, I can just turn around and go back the other way if I had to. We don't have that in the city. In the city, you're always like, it's really hard to get away from the triggers. So we also get trigger stacking, which is where we've got maybe your dog can handle one of these triggers, but when it's like you go out for a walk and it's like 50 of them, there at some point there's going to be this like straw that broke the camel's back.
Mhm.
And especially if it's people, other dogs, in the city we see a lot of cyclists, cars. A lot of these dogs struggle with like intersections, so there's like a bunch of cars and all of a sudden they start moving. They may be fine with cars unless there's multiple or like loud ones. So all of these things, all of a sudden it's like, where do you go to get away from them? And then if a lot of people in these environments are living in condos, apartments. So then we have like the hallways, the lobby, the elevators, the stairways, all of these things to navigate just to go out for a pee.
Mhm.
And so and then a lot of people live in the city, they don't have vehicles because that's part of the perk of living in a city. You don't have to like, drive everywhere. So getting to somewhere where you can go and be at peace with your dog, it's really like, when I go into a consult with someone who lives in the city in one of these areas, honestly, like my heart goes out to them instantly. And like I get this kind of like sinking feeling in my stomach because I know that we're just to go for a pee break, we're going to just be pummeled by triggers.
Mhm.
And these dogs, and then they just don't, also it's harder to exercise them. I'm very lucky. I've got an acreage where I can like run my dogs. I live in a very rural like place where there's lots of places to go without dogs. But if you don't have that, you lose out on these dogs. Obviously they need they have high exercise and enrichment needs. So it just becomes, I think it's harder, right? It's just harder to set them up for success. And then that trickles down and is frustrating for the owner as well. I think it can be exhausting.
And a lot of the dogs also have some type of like noise sensitivity as well. It's like you live in an apartment. So much of like when I think about reactivity plans for someone is like, okay, they had a stressful day. The next couple days, you're gonna avoid triggers. You're gonna like maybe not go on a walk. You're going to have like decompression time at home, all that kind of stuff. But like, yeah, like you said, I have to go out to go pee. So I have to deal with all this like trigger stuff going out. And then also even in the apartment, maybe we have to have like white noise plus music and like noise layering and all the stuff to kind of like combat the outside, just like the city noise that's going on and lights and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I just really strongly believe that these dogs need to like complete that stress cycle and recover. And they just like are never able to fully recover because there's always another thing.
No, it's nonstop. Like you say, it's like, kids running down the hallway and like the sounds coming from upstairs and like there's just nowhere to escape from it. I can't like we did I used to live in North Vancouver years ago, and we had 3 dogs. We had a very reactive Boston Terrier at the time. We didn't have a yard. I had a toddler. We had this Boston Terrier. We had a Border Collie pit bull and a pit bull. And there wasn't even a yard where we could go for pees. And so we had a reactive dog. And every time we went outside, we had to go all of them on leash, and like every time just for pees and poos. So it is possible. It's just, I've lived that way and I've lived this way, and I can tell you it's just it's so much easier now to just
Mhm.
even meet their needs, you
Mhm.
know.
One of
So
one of the other episodes that I think will be out by the time I release this one, we're talking about just like reactivity in cities. Um, and I think like there's just like there's this idea of like, oh, if you move out of the city, move to a quieter place. But it's like, okay, not everyone has a car, not everyone has money to just like get up and move, right? So I think some of my social media posts that have talked about like taking a break from walking or going to quiet areas seem to frustrate people because they just feel like, okay, that advice is useless to me because I can't do that.
yeah,
So it's just, yeah, it's a hard situation to be in for sure.
it's
Um,
very hard. There's actually, I have a past client, and she just moved, her and her family just moved with their dogs. And I've had other clients talk about it, but like most people don't have like $1 million. Like in British Columbia, or like our real estate
ah,
is out of control. And so it's not, again, it's not a feasible situation for people to just move or like find somewhere quiet with their dog, right? It's just,
yeah, well, and people have other priorities. I think sometimes trainers or people that are really big, like dog hobbyists, forget that kind of the normal and air quotes people, they have their dog is one of their priorities, not their only priority. And so, like, to expect them to just change their entire life for their dog is a big ask.
yeah, I
You
agree.
talked a little bit about exercise, and it works well because that's what I wanted to talk about next. So, herding breeds are like they're very well known for having high exercise and mental enrichment needs. I think across the board, even people who aren't that familiar with them kind of have that idea in their head. Um, and then we also think about progress with reactivity or any kind of behavior issue is in large part dependent on that dog having their needs met consistently. So I was interested to hear your thoughts on exercise and enrichment for these guys. And the idea that like, oh, the dog just needs a job. We just need to give the dog a job. And I know you talk about this a lot.
Mhm.
And if they have a job, then they won't be reactive or they won't have these behavior issues. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. And then also like, do these dogs need a lot of exercise? Is more exercise always better?
Yeah, both really great questions. So if we start with so we hear this all of the time. Your dog needs a job. Your dog needs a job. Your dog needs a job. And that's because they come from working backgrounds. Um, and I acknowledge that they need to be able to be herdy. They need something to do. They, thrive doing jobs for us. That's why we created them in the first place. What I hate about the saying your dog needs a job is that it doesn't give any struggling owner anything to go on, and when you look at the jobs that they were all bred to do, they were all bred for very different jobs. So if you say that to a shepherd owner versus like a cattle dog owner versus a border collie owner, like what does that even mean? Like, do you understand what job that they were, originally bred to do, and how can you give them a version of that in their home? But it also is used often to explain away aggression or fear and big problems that we see where, dogs are struggling. And not working livestock is not why dogs are fearful or showing aggressive behaviors or, necessarily anxious and things like that. Or even like I've even seen people say that compulsive disorders are only in dogs who don't work, which is completely, absolutely
Mhm.
untrue. There's working line dogs being bred with compulsive disorder routinely by crappy breeders. But so it's we see that people will say, well, your dog bit someone, they just need a job, they need a farm, they need to go live on a farm. Like farmers are not they're not
All of these
taking
aggressive dog farms that exist out there.
no, there's a place out there for dogs that bite in a farmer world, and it's not working on their farm. And they don't want them. And there's not a lineup of farmers looking to take them. Like it's not like there's a surplus of, working situations for these dogs. but it's not why they're experiencing fear in the first place. So I find it like, it just doesn't, it's usually thrown out there like it's like some sort of knowledge about these dogs, but it doesn't give us anything to go on. Um, so, but when we look at what they need, they do their, so like, again, we're going to cycle back to what traits did we put into them when we were developing them as breeds. And, nobody was breeding border collies who were difficult to motivate off the couch to go and work the sheep and move the sheep in the morning, or out in the morning and in the evening. Nobody was breeding a line of cattle dogs because they didn't want to go out and work the cows. They're bred to just go at a moment's notice, right? Like they don't need a lot of motivation to just get to work and get up and do the thing. And so, and they can go all day long. Like it's, we talk about dogs who are like over exercise and stuff, but like these dogs can really, they can go all day. And I've heard of stories of dogs doing 50K in a day
Mhm.
easily. One of the friends that I have who she works her border collies. She knows of a story in the UK where they were way out working sheep, 50K. The dogs were running like 50K a day, and on the way back to the farm, the handlers said we should let them run beside the quads because they need to get exercise. Because in their mind, the dog hadn't exercised, right?
Mhm.
So if you breed a dog, those dogs now have puppies, and we put that puppy into the home in the condo in downtown Vancouver. That dog's bred for that level of intense physical
Mhm.
activity every day
Mhm.
and willingness to get up and do the job. You're not going to keep up with that dog. Like nobody is going to keep up with
Yeah.
that dog. So, but we have to try and meet those requirements in some way. Like I'm a firm believer that these dogs need to be able to run. I've worked with border collies who have never been off leash before. And personally, I can't get behind it. Like there's no way that I'm going to say like that's okay and I think we're meeting the needs of that dog. Like I don't think we are. And I think they have to be able to run. I think they need physical exercise. I do think that when they've had it, that the flip side of that is that they are fulfilled and calm. Like my dogs are sound asleep right now, all of them, and it's because they got out for a run this morning. But the problem is often that they will need more than we can keep up with. Most homes are not prepared for it. And the other problem of that is that it gets flipped back around as being that becomes a behavior problem. So if they're like bored and antsy and they want to do something and they're like eager to go out and do the thing, we usually will. I've had a lot of people reach out that is, I need this fixed, when really it's not a behavior problem. It's just that we have to exercise the dog. So I'm a firm believer and advocate for like these dogs have to run and they have to be exercised um, as part of their daily routine.
And I think I'm vigorously nodding as you're talking because I think it's a bit of a touchy subject for people because I think there is this belief out there among some people that a long line is this like almost the same as off leash or like kind of meets the same need. And of course, like a long line meets that need than a 6 foot leash. But when you think about these dogs running 50K, a long line, unless you're running with them, they're really not getting the same type of freedom of movement and running exercise on a long line. And then it becomes the question of, okay, well, my dog is reactive. I can't just take him to the dog park. Yes, we know there's sniff spot, so there's like rentable backyards and stuff to
Yeah.
get them to run. But I think what a lot of people kind of where a lot of people end up is I know my dog needs to run, but I don't know how to
Mhm.
get them to run, right? In my situation. Do you have any, like, what are some of your creative solutions for people who say that, who say, like, I know that I need to meet this need, but there's really nowhere I can take them that's safe?
Yeah, and that is a thing, and I I get it, and I know in some cases we're not going to find the sniff spot, or we're not going to have the big backyard or whatever. Long lines are sometimes the next best thing, I think for a lot of dogs. A client sent me a video the other day of their dog in a field. It's like a baseball field, tons of space, but the dog is reactive. So they do have them on a long line so that they can manage that, the dog's not going to run off if they see someone. And they're using a flirt pole and they're playing with the dog. And the dog is like able to at least like move its joints, right? It's out, it's running around, it's moving. He's like frolicking. It's like lovely to see. That is probably the best he's going to get given their situation. But there's at least an attempt being made to let him move. So, if we can help it, I would love it that those dogs, that the flirt pole and the long line aren't their only source of exercise. It might be that that's the best we have.
Mhm.
I'm also encouraged though, like there is more and more popping up as options for these dogs. Like 2 or 3 months ago, we didn't have sniff spots in my area. I went on the other day and looked, and we have some now that are about like half an acre. I think each one was like half an acre. That's an option, right? That wasn't there before. Private dog parks are becoming more popular. More classes are being set up to accommodate reactive dogs, like scent work classes and things like that. So I think we're becoming more accepting of
Mhm.
these dogs. And so I think their options are slowly opening up. But for some of them, we've just got to try and so you might be then trying to use enrichment to try and like counter some of that pent up stuff and get them thinking. So we'll do a lot of, like, I love trick training. I don't know if you
Mhm.
ever use this,
Mhm.
like prescribe it for your clients,
Mhm.
but the thing that I love about trick training is that so their body's obviously not moving the same way as running, but it's engaging and they're thinking and they're having to think things through. And what I love about it for our reactive dogs is that there's not the same risk factor and there's not the same fallout for when things go awry. So if we don't get the dog to learn the spin or like the play dead or whatever, we had fun doing it. And
Mhm.
so for the owner, it's a relief, right? Because it's fun for them and they don't get the frustration of like, oh my gosh, he reacted and it all fell apart. And for
Mhm.
the dog, they get to participate in something where they get it right too.
Mhm.
Um, and I love that. Like, I think that should be something like that should be a protocol for all people with reactive dogs so that you do breathe some life back into the relationship because and you do a great job of speaking about this in your content and on the podcast, but self-care and making sure that you're being taken care of. I think, when we're talking about these things, it can be so frustrating for clients, but doing something fun like trick training is just like an outlet for everybody. So there's just, we've got to try and unfortunately, we've got to try and like if we can't do this, we've got to how else can we kind of build something in for these dogs that they get some engagement in their world so that their world doesn't just keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller with nothing.
Mhm. It's so helpful for people to be able to do something fun because I think people get so bogged down by like, okay, we have to go out and do a reactivity training session today. And like especially if they're in a city, they're always in management mode and always practicing all their management behaviors. And it's like, this is like so not easy necessarily, but so like it can be so freeing to just like, okay, I'm just gonna enjoy my dog. My dog's gonna enjoy me. Like you said, there's no pressure to like make progress. And also these dogs are fun to train too. So it's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
us to do trick training with these dogs. Um, the other thing that came to mind when you were talking about trick training is I talk to people a lot about like types of mental enrichment and like, throwing down a puzzle bowl or like a slow feeder or whatever. Probably not that enriching for most dogs unless they've never used a slow feeder before. Like most herding dogs are going to get through that in 1 second. And so like thinking about the value you're getting out of the mental enrichment and something like trick training where they're kind of like solving problems and having to figure out what you're asking, it's like a lot more tiring for their brain than
Yeah,
throwing a Kong wobbler at them or whatever.
yeah. It's fun too. Like,
Yeah.
I have a client right now who they're earning like trick dog titles in the meantime, like they're working on so
Hmm.
much stuff. But they're throwing in something that's fun and loving it. Like, and I love getting those updates that they got a new title or something happened, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a place for the more passive mental enrichment when you're busy, or, if you want to help your dog recover, licking and sniffing and all that. It doesn't all have to be that like high intensity mental enrichment, but it definitely plays a role for these
Yeah.
dogs, especially. And then I also think that like the mental enrichment piece comes back to that, like, okay, what were they bred for? What are their natural instincts, and how can we like mimic that in our condo life?
Yeah. I'm always like, that's sort of what I, start with is what would their day-to-day life look like on a farm, like where they're actually actively working. And then how can I mimic that in my home? And now we have sheep, but we didn't before. And so how can I mimic that? And, so it's not just necessarily in cities, but like in general, like how can I replicate what their traditional home might have looked like?
Mhm.
And I get a lot of joy out of that. Like I really enjoy meeting all of those needs. It's part of what I
Mhm.
like about having them. So,
Mhm.
and I think sometimes we can get kind of bogged down by it, but I like to, like, if you can find ways to make it enjoyable for you as well,
Mhm.
um, and really enjoy that process.
Are you
It's
still offering that? I think you changed the name, but it was dry herding before that.
Yeah, I call it urban herding now, but or dry herding, dry land herding is kind of what it's called in the herding world. But it's teaching these dogs traditional herding cues on a toy instead of livestock. And so I started doing it with Griffin when he was younger, and we couldn't find a suitable trainer to help us with starting him on livestock. And so I wanted to give him a variation of that. I wanted to give him like an approximation of that. And so dry herding was born out of that. And for us, luckily, it actually has translated to him on sheep as well. So when I got him on sheep, he already knew his flanks and knew a bunch of the stuff because
Mhm.
we had practiced it so much. But I love teaching it. It's a fun online class. And it's so much fun to just see these dogs kind of pick up on things that they were bred to do,
Yeah.
but we just use a frisbee instead of a sheep.
Yeah, it's such a cool option. And then the other thing I wanted to mention before we move on from exercise is on the other side of the coin, rest. Right? A
Yeah.
lot of the time you see these dogs where people are like, they need to go, go, go. We need like they need a lot of exercise, they need a lot of mental enrichment. And then you see the dog that they're getting almost no kind of quality rest throughout the day.
Yeah. Yeah. And this one is, I think it's tricky, right? Because when I talk about it, I don't want to give the idea that I'm saying like run these dogs into the ground and things like that. I think people think that we're trying to say that, and I'm not. But most dogs, usually when I see a client who is like every like aspect of the dog's life, they have to do something more. And like, what else can I do? And I'm doing Kongs, and I'm doing bully sticks, and I'm doing puzzle feeders, and I'm scatter feeding, and I'm doing trick training, and I'm doing flirt pole, and I'm running him, and I'm playing fetch, and I'm doing all of these things, and it's all in one day.
Mhm.
What else can I do because he's still too much and all of that stuff? A lot of those cases have gone on, not from me, from a veterinarian, have gone on to have a diagnosis of anxiety.
Mhm.
So sometimes we want to flag that if your dog isn't able to settle ever when their needs are met, like it's one thing
Mhm.
if you haven't been out for a run or a
Mhm.
walk in like a week, but if your dog is constantly having their needs met and you're not able to, like you're barely holding it together, to me there's a red flag that gets
Mhm.
raised around that. So we have to be careful that some of these dogs, it's not just a matter of like I'm not resting or I'm not sleeping. Some of these dogs actually have like underlying issues that are,
Mhm.
they look like maybe the dog is just exercising too much or too, but
Mhm.
actually there's something else going on. um but I do see it in puppies, like the herding breed puppies. Like obviously they often have trouble settling down and having naps. So encouraging that is never a bad thing. Or with Griffin, I did like scheduled nap time. Like he was a baby, like he
Mhm.
went down for naps. And if he didn't go down for naps, he would go into like what we called cranky baby mode, where he
Yeah.
was just like, yeah, you like couldn't think straight. He was like a little bit of a wild child. But you know, I think in most cases, um, most of these dogs can go more than we can. So it's rare that I see dogs that are just over run, for
Yeah.
example. Like I think we talk about that as like something like, oh, there's like the owners that go and play fetch for 4 hours. I've yet to see that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think most of the time they're under exercised.
Yeah.
But certainly if if you're listening and you have a dog who isn't settling and is unable to settle and you feel like you're meeting their needs, I would like really recommend reaching out to somebody, and your veterinarian, because there's a lot of things that can be underlying there.
Mhm.
And it's not normal for them to not be able to settle and like
Yeah.
relax.
Yeah, because I have seen dogs where they do go down for a nap. And I've talked to people about trying to set them up to have a nap throughout the day so they are getting at least some rest throughout the day. But it's true that like once they're an adult dog, you shouldn't have to force them to sleep
Yeah.
if they're
They, I mean, like, I don't think my dogs have moved since I've been on this
yeah.
call. Um, but yeah, they're, I don't know. I really don't think, I think it's more often that it's harder to keep up with them
Mhm.
than we're overrunning them, if that makes
Mhm.
sense. And I know it gets thrown out there a lot that they need to settle and they need to learn how to, like, there's protocols to relax them and all of these things. Typically, I think if their needs are met, the average dog who is healthy and of sound mind and body, when their needs are met, they will, the flip side of meeting their needs is that they will chill out.
On their own, yeah. Um, I want to talk a little bit about the actual training for these dogs for reactivity. I think we've both used engage, disengage, which is one of the more common ones, training exercises. One thing that I always notice about these dogs, I think it was even taught in the academy curriculum, but I definitely notice it, is because they love to work with us and they love training and they love working so much, they sometimes will accept food and keep training around the trigger, even if they're actually not doing okay. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that because I think the example in the academy was like the dog will keep kind of moving towards something until they bite the person because they
Yeah.
it's okay, but they just wanted to keep working. And when I'm doing anything like start buttons, for anyone who doesn't know, start buttons is like training the dog to opt into an interaction. I always talk to people about like we're gonna feed them either way. We're gonna make it so
Yeah.
that they get to keep playing the game even if they're not kind of consenting to the thing. And so I'm curious how you kind of go about troubleshooting that with clients where they're not sure like if their dog is participating in the training because they're actually relaxed and they're okay, or if they're just participating because they're enjoying the training but not really that feeling that good about the trigger.
Yeah, well, it's another great question. I mean, the big I would say like the vast majority of people that I work with, their dogs are pretty typical in that if they are over a threshold or they're like too close to their trigger, they're going to react whether or not they're like they won't not react for the food.
Mm,
But more often I see dogs who are hiding how they feel when they're working around a toy. So
mm,
maybe they're at the park and they're playing frisbee. These dogs are like, they will tune out everything to get to work. And so a lot of them translate that over to a toy. And so I do see a lot of clients who are like, well, he's, with his ball, he can go by anything. So I just use his ball everywhere we go. Just because he's now got the ball, like the ball isn't removing fear.
mm, mm,
So we would still have to assume that like underneath everything that he's still concerned about, let's say it's the kids at the playground, right? So we just have to be really careful not to use props like that or use things that the dog will engage with to bring them outside of their comfort zone. I'm
mm,
cool with using it at a distance,
mm,
but not to get them closer to their trigger. Just because we don't see a reaction doesn't necessarily mean that they're comfortable inside, right?
mm,
And like it's almost, if you think about it, almost like using a distraction more than anything. And that can have, you can be then pushing your dog too close to something that they're afraid of just because they're not reacting because they have the frisbee there or the ball there.
mm, mm.
And so that's something that I see more often. Um, Speaking of reactivity, can you hear my dogs barking?
No, I can't. Zoom isn't picking it up, but I saw Griff get up.
They're
Oh, there
barking.
it is.
Yeah, my husband just walked by to go for his lunch break, and movement triggers herding breed
Mhm,
dogs.
mhm,
And before they realize who it is, they will usually bark at them. But yeah, so always making sure you're not using their ability to work and tune things out. Like, don't bring them too close to their trigger. Always work them at a distance that they're comfortable with. For me, I will, if I have to walk Griffin by a group of kids, I will use the frisbee to get him past the kids.
mhm,
But I don't pretend in my mind that he's okay with the kids in that context. And so just be really careful about how you're using that. Um, And I like to just read body language. There's still going to be, it can be really nuanced, but I'm still going to see signs that he's uncomfortable about the kids,
Mhm.
even though I've got the Frisbee there. He might like even, he'll keep an eye on them. Like I can see him dart his eyes over to kind of keep an eye on where they are. He might glance back, that kind of thing. So more than anything, we've got to get really good at reading body language, especially when we're working around lots of triggers and like any triggers really, but getting really good at spotting those little fine, little tiny things that your dog might be telling you that they're uncomfortable that we might miss, and then don't exploit their ability to work
Mhm.
through fear.
Mhm. I think where I find clients get stuck is less of like being at the point between whether they're going to choose the ball or the frisbee or reacting, and more that, like I always describe it like a stoplight where there's that yellow zone in between the red and the green where they're kind of like they're not okay but they haven't reacted yet. And I think that's an area where a lot of people keep training because they think, oh, the dog's not reacting. And I think that's probably where people are making the mistake of thinking their dog is in that green zone or they're okay because they're working for the ball or the frisbee. um but you definitely see even subtle things like weight shifts towards or away from the trigger, or like you said, kind of not being able to fully disengage from the trigger and having to keep checking on them. Um, with those dogs that are so excited by their toy, would you choose to use food instead as like a better barometer of how they're feeling?
Well, I usually will go to food first. Like in any context, my food is usually my go-to.
Mhm.
Because, when we talk about, so, when we look at, let's say agility, right? When we're doing like some of the foundational stuff, we might use food. We're doing like little
Mhm.
trials over jumps back and forth, or like training a dog where to place their feet on, the teeter-totter, that kind of stuff. But when we're getting them going, we're using toys because we want that explosive,
Mhm.
we get bang for our buck, right? You have a tug toy and your dog knows that when they come out of that tunnel, they're going to get the tug. You're going to get the speed as a factor. So when I'm working with reactivity, I'm trying to like take it down a notch.
Yeah.
And so I don't usually want to add in toys because I don't always like the sort of level of excitement that it brings, right? I'm usually trying to get the dog to come down a little bit. Where I do find it really helpful is with car chasers. So some car chasers, it's really hard to find a distance that they're comfortable with. They will react even if they see a car really far away. And most of them don't want to take food. They're just already whoop in over their head. They're spinning, barking, they might be grabbing a leash, redirecting, that sort of thing. And I would rather them be doing that onto a toy or being able to take some of that excitement out on the toy. But when I'm working on like changing the mind of a dog who is afraid of something and they're reacting, I like food.
Yeah.
And the great thing about that is like the vast majority of dogs that I work with, they will stop taking food when they're too close to a trigger,
Mhm.
even the herdy ones. So it really helps give us that gauge of like, some people are like, well, that they won't take food, then we have an issue, unless we
Mhm.
have a dog who is like, got gastro issues and
Yeah.
things like that. If they're a foodie dog, which most dogs are, and you can't get them to take food around a trigger, I like that barometer, right? I like to know that we're too close. So, but just in terms of like pouring gasoline on the fire, I try to avoid toys as being my go-to on like a reactivity case.
Yeah, and some dogs will still eat when they're concerned, but their eating will change likely. Um, I've used toys for management. I've recommended people use toys for management, but yeah, like you said, never to actually change how they're feeling, more just like we need to get past the
Yeah.
situation, and the food maybe isn't even strong enough for the dog to kind of pass a trigger in close proximity. So I find it useful in that way, but especially with these herding breed dogs, I'm always very like thoughtful and careful about how I'm introducing the toy because I do worry about that. Um, so if we think about herding dogs really liking training and liking working with us and kind of learning new things, would you err more on the side of something like a desensitization and counter conditioning protocol versus an obedience-based reactivity training protocol where the dog is actually learning to do something around the trigger?
I'm just more biased towards desensitization and counter conditioning in all of my practice. Like it's my it's where I started, like working with dogs in the shelter and things like that. That's what we were doing. And I think it's powerful. And I love it. And so I always default to DSCC on these cases. The one thing that I usually will have my clients do that's more like obedience based or like more operant based is like a U-turn to get away from a trigger. And I get them to practice it over and over and over again so that not just for the dog, but for the person, it's autopilot.
Mhm.
Because when you like are walking on the street and you're like, okay, my trainer told me
Yeah.
that like I'm supposed to do this and this and this and this and all of these things are happening, and then somebody comes out of a car that you weren't expecting and your dog is like bark bark,
Yeah.
lunges and like all right, it can be really easy to like it all falls apart for you if you're somebody who's just getting into training and like this is like you've got to get through like learning all of these things.
Mhm.
So I love having them practice the U-turn over and over and over again so that they can say, let's go, or whatever their cue is going to be. And the dog knows what that means. And they may have practiced it 5 times already today. And the owner is able to also fall back on that muscle memory of just doing it like it's autopilot.
Mhm.
But I just love DSCC for these dogs.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's definitely biases between trainers. Like, so I know some people really like using like a watch me cue or a leave it. I use a lot of engage disengage, which I think has both classical and operant kind of components to it. But I do think that if you are using like an obedience focused or like a operant conditioning focus, that you do want to kind of think about like, is this dog enjoying working with me? Or are they actually relaxed, right? Like, can
Yeah.
they do the thing, but they're not actually doing okay? Because I think
Yeah,
it's a
I mean,
lot.
what I love most about like, for Mozzie, for example, when she was going through like the really acute stage of her fear, my goal was not to see like, could I get her to engage with me, or was she doing this, or was she doing that? My goal was like make her feel better about what she's
Mhm.
experiencing, and that's still to this day. I've never like I love engage disengage as a protocol, and I love that it's like readily accessible for
Mhm.
owners, and I recommend it a lot. But I never feel like, oh, now I've got to move Mozzie into like asking her for a behavior, asking her to disengage. I still to this day just work on making sure she's comfortable around a trigger. And
Mhm.
then that all just everything else well, I mean, the hope is everything else melts away because it's all symptomatic of how they're feeling.
Mhm.
So I'm never looking at like, what are you doing? What could you be doing? I'm always looking at like, how are you feeling and
Mhm.
supporting them on that. And I think for some clients, when they're asking for, let's say they're really looking for a disengage, right? I
Mhm.
think some of them can get really hung up on looking for that they miss the opportunity to support their dog past that with that
Mhm.
trigger. And then the trigger's gone and
Mhm.
everything's kind of fallen apart. And they're like, the dog hasn't looked at them.
Yeah.
Instead, like, does your dog need support right now? And can we get in there and just like support? And that's where like, I think magic can happen in that if we're
Mhm.
supporting how they're feeling rather than like being overly concerned about what they're doing.
Yeah, well, and that's where people get frustrated with the training is that like the dog's not doing the thing that they're expecting the dog to do. Whereas like if your order of events is right with something like desensitization and counter conditioning, you're probably going to get a dog that maybe checks in with you when they see a trigger and you get those like nice behaviors that you want as a side effect anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. They'll start to, I mean, that's the cool thing. Like Griffin now, he'll like see a deer and he like, he's not upset. He quite likes the deer. He'll like charge down into the yard, bark, bark, bark. And then he usually will disengage and come back to me.
Mhm.
Because I've done so much of like rewarding him and like, when he sees it like over and over and over again, that now I get that as a nice little side effect. When all I had to do was just reward him in the moment of the barking at the
Mhm.
thing.
Yeah.
And now he's like, good things happen back there. I'm going to go back there. Right. So
Mhm.
we get there in a roundabout way. Um, and I think it's a much more solid base for a lot of these dogs as well. Like I think, um, I like DRIs for reactivity, but again, I think we can focus a little bit too much on like getting that behavior. And I think it's something maybe executed by a trainer better, because our timing is good and our order of events is good, and we're going to support the dog if the dog is upset. And we do get that nice, like CC likes, we get a nice side effect there where the dog is getting rewarded every time they see their trigger. But I think we can, if it's done incorrectly, we just get a lot of like asking for the sit over and over and over again. The dog doesn't sit, the trigger is gone, and we've missed the opportunity to like really get a nice pairing there. So
Mm-hmm. For anyone who doesn't know, a DRI is a differential reinforcement of an incompatible behavior. So that basically means when your dog sees a trigger, they look at you, or they sit, or they lie down, or whatever, that behavior that's incompatible with barking and lunging. I think the other issue I see with DRIs, and I think if they're done well, this isn't an issue, but people are in a rush to get to the actual problem scenario. And so really, if they're done well, we need to spend some time getting that strong foundation so the dog can do that behavior in the house and in the backyard and outside when there's no triggers around. But people want to get to the issue, and so they kind of rush through it, and then it's just not strong enough to work around triggers.
yeah. Yeah, I did a video of that on my Instagram like years ago where I was showing like asking Griffin to sit. And I asked him like 10 times and he couldn't do it in a field with like
Mhm.
nothing around him. So that would clearly not be something that I would want to ask him for in a, like where he's like in over his head and he's by something that's really scary. I'm obviously not going to ask him to sit
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
he can't do it anyway on a good day. Like half the time he'll sit, half the time he'll lie down, half the time he'll ignore me.
Mhm.
And so it's like, that's why I really try and get people to practice that U-turn over and over and over again. The dog has to be fluent in it. They have to know what, because in the moment when they're freaking out, that's not the time to be asking them for something that they don't understand or they can't follow through with.
No, and if it's well executed, you should be doing it when they're in that green zone under threshold distance, and then kind
Yeah.
of slowly working closer. Um, I'm curious if you want to talk a little bit about what you're offering for these reactive herding dogs these days. I know you offer webinars and classes, and I think you're taking a break from the one-on-one right now, right? So do you want to talk a little bit about, if people are interested in working with you, what types of services you offer?
Yeah, for sure. So webinars, I've got a whole bunch of webinars that I run regularly, but they're also all available on demand on the website. So everything that we might experience with these dogs, I try to cover: reactivity, sound sensitivities, compulsive disorders. Those are all of the topics that I just really love. I know it's kind of nerdy, but I love diving into that stuff. So I've got webinars on all of those. And right now I am running the group class for reactivity. So it is an online program where we meet, and I basically teach people everything that they need to know about reactivity and how to work on it like they're a pro. I'm a firm believer that our clients, like, we don't want to bog them down with too much like science talk and things like that. But I am a firm believer that they can learn. Like, I started out as an exasperated owner of like a Boston Terrier who was reactive, and I had no idea what I was doing. And I'm capable of learning these things. I think our clients are as well. So I like to teach people as if they're a trainer, and I like to try and make them into little mini dog trainers. And that's what the program is all about. And I'm also, right now, I've also got my book, Urban Sheepdog. It's all about, we talk about reactivity in the book, but it's everything that you need to know about your herding breed dog. And I'm currently writing a book about reactivity in herding breeds as well. And that should be out in the fall. So,
Ooh, soon. That's exciting.
yeah.
Yeah, I've been impressed just watching how successful your book has been, and people, like, I've had clients even mention it to me, like, "Oh, this girl Emily wrote this book.
Uh,
I know her."
well, I always love hearing that. Like, I didn't know how it was going to go writing it. But again, it's like, I think it's at the end of the day, I really think we have a miscommunication. I think we have dogs that don't really understand where we're coming from, and we don't understand where they're coming from. And some of the power in getting over some of the hurdles of these things is just understanding where they're coming from. And I know as dog trainers, we try to say, like, don't get inside of the dog's head, but I love to dive in there and like peel everything out so that people just see their dogs for what's actually happening rather than what it might look like is happening, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, so I appreciate that. And I've been overwhelmed with just how people have been receiving the book. So Urban Sheepdog. It's on Amazon if anyone wants to check it out.
Awesome. And you can find Emily on Instagram. It's Wild at Heart Dogs, right?
Yes, Wild at Heart Dogs on Facebook and Instagram, wildatheartdogs@gmail.com, and wildatheartdogs.com is the
Yes,
website.
if you have a herding dog, you should follow Emily because she posts a lot of content that you'll enjoy for sure. Thank you so much, Emily, for joining me this episode. I can say with confidence that this conversation will resonate with both trainers and dog guardians, especially those with herding breeds. And I hope that it will provide some concrete tips and next steps for anyone struggling with this issue. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I had a blast. So thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Reactive Dog Pod. Please make sure to subscribe, rate, and review so more reactive dog guardians can find me. If you need help with your reactive dog, I offer one-on-one support, group training, and an online membership, all available virtually worldwide. Information on where to find me is in the show notes for each episode. Thanks again, and happy training.